Hello everyone, and welcome to Rome Retold. I am your host Tim, and together we'll be venturing on a journey to explore the history of ancient Rome. Today's episode will tie up some of the loose ends about Rome's Republican government. Season 1 covered 2 episodes on this topic, but we need one more to really wrap up some of the final developments that happened to the Republic during the early period and during the conflict of the orders. The Republic was continually evolving throughout this period, particularly within the legislative assemblies and the higher magistracies. In this episode, we'll take a look at some of the bigger developments that came about that we didn't cover during Season 1. As a brief refresher, you'll remember that upon creating the Republic, the Romans had taken the powers of the king and diluted them amongst several offices in what we would call the executive branch of government. These new offices were chiefly the consuls, praetors, and the rex sacrorum, and a few other ones that also came around over time. As for the legislative assemblies, the first one, which was the Curiate Assembly, had been created by Romulus, but this was effectively sterilized by the time the Republic came about, and it only fulfilled ceremonial functions throughout most of the Republic. The second assembly, which was the Centuriate Assembly, was also likely founded under the kings, or in the very least during the early Republic, and it was an assembly that handed more power over to the Roman people. After the aristocracy overthrew the monarchy, they allowed this second assembly to continue to exist as a way to appease the Roman people and the army following the overthrow. Now, despite that, the aristocracy engineered the way the second assembly operated to such a degree that the average Roman had little to no say. Yet, the fact that they did on paper gave the Republic a semblance of legitimacy. However, I'll add again that despite the lack of true democracy within the Republic, the aristocracy did all of this as a way to prevent someone from amongst their own ranks to try and install themselves as a tyrant by pandering to the Roman people and trying to bribe them with all sorts of nice things, which was basically what had happened at the end of the regal period. By engineering the way the assembly worked, the aristocracy believed they were helping to prevent tyranny. But again, it was at the cost of the Roman people's participation in the government. So, that's the situation for the first 2 legislative assemblies. However, the Romans eventually instituted a third assembly and probably even a fourth. I say probably as there is a bit of debate on the fourth one, as there is with so much in Roman history, but these last 2 assemblies is what we're going to turn to now. The third assembly that was created by the Romans was called the Tribal Assembly. It was called this because the Romans organized the voting blocks for this assembly based around the different Roman tribes. These were basic voting sections that were split up based around where you lived geographically within Italy. In a way, it's similar to modern voting districts, where things are simply broken up in a similar way. Everyone living in a certain locality all goes down to vote at their local school, community center, or wherever, and this is all split up by certain local geographic lines, roads, or whatever else. This was all opposed to the second assembly, whose voting blocks were broken up specifically by one's wealth. So at first glance, the tribal assembly appears to be much more egalitarian and fair. Every Roman had the right to attend this assembly, just like the second one. So on the surface, it would seem that Rome's third assembly is approaching closer to something we might consider as being democratic, since it's not split up based on wealth. The tribal assembly held several different important functions in the Roman government. It was responsible for electing the lesser magistrates, such as the quaestors and aediles, and it also elected the Pontifex Maximus, which was Rome's high priest. This assembly could also introduce legislation that was binding on all Roman citizens, and so we can almost compare Rome's second and third assemblies as something close to an upper and lower parliament, or even to America's Senate and House of Representatives. These are all instances of 2 different legislative bodies capable of making laws, and one represents the more elite side of society, while the other represents more of the everyday person. Even in ancient Rome, both of these assemblies were responsible for choosing certain government officials, yet both assemblies could introduce and pass legislation. The main difference was in how they organized their voting blocks. So, all seems good here initially, right? The Romans have finally achieved some sort of access in their government for the common Roman. That was the prevailing idea among historians of ancient Rome for quite a while. But, like so many things I've mentioned in this podcast, this idea has kind of come apart over the last 50 to 100 years or so with more critical study. Although the voting blocks in the Third Assembly were not explicitly based on wealth, implicitly they were. Although their organization was based on where a Roman lived geographically, everything was still gerrymandered, just like the Second Assembly. There were a total of 35 tribes in the tribal assembly. 4 of these represented the urban area of Rome, and the remaining 31 tribes were rural voting districts. Despite no obvious distinction of wealth here, this was all heavily skewed in favor of the aristocracy, as it was never realistic for the average Roman living in the far-flung countryside to travel to the city to participate in the assembly. Most rural Romans would have been consumed with maintaining their farms and their families' safety, and would have had little to no incentive to spend multiple days traveling to and from the city, something that would have been quite dangerous in and of itself. All just to cast a vote for legislation or people they likely knew nothing about. However, the wealthy aristocracy who owned lavish villas in the countryside and had large retinues of people and soldiers that could accompany them for protection when they traveled, definitely had the free time to travel and participate quite easily. And so, the Third Assembly's 31 rural voting blocks would have been almost entirely populated by the wealthy elite when it came time for them to cast their votes in Rome, even though, in theory, the poor could attend. Rome's 4 urban voting blocks in the Third Assembly would have likely been attended by the average Roman people, but these 4 were greatly outnumbered by the other 31. So why was this Third Legislative Assembly even created in the first place? Well, the honest answer is, historians don't really know for sure, and it's still a hotly debated subject. Overall, the ancient accounts surrounding the creation of the tribal assembly are highly suspicious, and the only thing we know for sure is that it was created. It has been speculated that it was created in an attempt for more free access to the Roman people, yet it was slowly manipulated by the aristocracy over time, or even that it was simply organized differently to allow for different auspices. Now, these were the various religious rituals and formulas practiced for elections and legislation that were supposed to obtain the proper blessings from the gods. The Romans were forever obsessed with precise formulaic procedures, so it is entirely possible that the Third Assembly was only created after some new obsession for creating a new set of sacrifices and rituals to be offered to the gods before enacting legislation. There are a lot of ideas that have been offered over the years, but again, all we can really say for sure is that this assembly was indeed created, but we don't exactly know how or why, or even exactly when. Mentioning not knowing things, I'll pause here just to touch on something. You may have probably noticed I've mentioned several times in the podcast how our understanding of things has changed over the last 100 years or so, and that is definitely the case. For hundreds, and even really for thousands of years, historians of ancient Rome did view the Republican government a bit superficially. They really only looked at the surface of how things worked and then concluded that the Republic truly was a democratic form of government operating in the ancient world as some sort of anomaly. Beginning in the 1900s, though, scholars started diving a bit deeper and looking at how the government actually functioned, and basically uncovered much of what I've already said, that the Republic was really just an aristocracy with the facade of a democracy. Why it took so long for scholars and historians to figure that out, I don't really have a good answer, other than that just happened to be the time that critical analyses began being more prevalent within history. I always try and drive the importance of these changes home, though, because it does still seem that within popular media, or even in casual conversations with people, this idea that Rome was a democracy is still very prevalent, but it is largely incorrect. Even though what we know about history is changing, and we don't always understand the whole picture yet, the things we learn today can still help build a better foundation for those who come after us. It's comparable to different concepts within traditional science or something like astrophysics. An entire concept may not be fully understood yet, but hopefully over time, people that come along later with more knowledge and technology may be able to piece together the whole picture. That's why, even in archaeology, at dig sites around the world, a portion of the site is intentionally left untouched, with the idea that it can be excavated further in the future when even more technological advancements have been made. Alright, so that's basically everything for the third assembly. But there is one more, fourth assembly, and for this one, there isn't even widespread agreement that it existed. And technically, it wasn't even an assembly, but a council. But this was really just a matter of semantics by the Romans, and to avoid unnecessary confusion here, I'm going to continue to call it the fourth assembly, although officially it was called the Plebeian Council. According to Roman literary tradition, mostly from Livy and Dionysius, when the plebs conducted their first secession in 494 BC, which, if you remember, was when the plebs were upset about the lack of farmland and about debt bondage, and they simply picked up and left the city of Rome and started their own city. During this event, it was said that the plebeian tribunes were created, as well as the Plebeian Council, a special legislative assembly comprised exclusively of the plebeians. Basically, when the patricians and plebeians worked out all their problems and everyone moved back into the city of Rome, some of our Roman authors tell us that the plebeian tribunes weren't the only new thing that was created, but that this plebeian council was also created. At first it was said that this assembly elected the plebeian tribunes, and later the plebeian aediles. However, much of this is not supported by other statements from other authors, or even from Livy and Dionysius themselves, who seem to contradict themselves and make confusing, contradictory statements about the existence of this assembly. Additionally, much of the Latin word use surrounding the assemblies and the creation of laws also seems to conflict with the idea of this assembly. The historian Gary Forsythe has been one of the main proponents for questioning our understanding of this assembly, and I think rightly so. But to make a very long and still ongoing debate simplified, I think I can say that the general consensus as it stands today is that in the beginning, this assembly was not a formal institution recognized by the Roman government, but was simply an informal gathering of the plebeians, and they did not have the authority to pass laws. However, as time went on and the popularity of this assembly grew, it did eventually become a formal institution, and by the year 287 BC in the early Republic and the advent of the Hortensian Law, this assembly gained the power to pass proper laws which applied to all Roman citizens. So, although the Plebeian Council may have had its informal origins around the start of the Republic, it did not become an official assembly until much later. And that is why I think it's best to refer to it as the Fourth Assembly, at least here within the podcast. So again, this Fourth Assembly was only made up by the plebeians, and by 287 BC, they could elect the plebeian tribunes and create their own laws. The plebeian tribunes could still veto any laws, and so by the late Republic, the Plebeian Council became a hotbed for political action and turmoil, as it was now the most powerful assembly in the Republic, and it could pretty much act unilaterally. We'll look at all of this a lot more once we get further along with our history, so I'll just leave off with the fact that this assembly was created during the early Republic, like most of the others. And that really rounds out the assemblies. Next, I'll turn to what we might call Rome's executive branch. Now, this was Rome's elected officials who ran different parts of the government. The officials that were considered to be more junior were typically elected by Rome's Third Assembly, which was again the tribal assembly, while the more senior officials were elected by the Second Assembly, which was the Centuriate Assembly. Typically, a wealthy Roman would start their political career in the military, working as a junior officer in something similar to what we might say was a lieutenant or captain, or roughly thereabouts. The first official public office one was typically voted into was a position called quaestor. A quaestor was basically assigned to be an assistant to one of the higher magistrates that held imperium, such as the consuls and the praetors, and they pretty much handled the various financial and logistical details for this larger position within the government and the military. After this, one could be elected to the position of aedile. There were only 4 of these in Rome each year, however, so this position wasn't actually mandatory to continue climbing the ladder. The aediles were in charge of organizing the public games and in overseeing various important market days throughout the year, so this position did grow to become important for one's political career, as it provided the chance to spend a lot of money on the people and throw lavish games and ceremonies, all with the hope of winning popularity with the Roman people. Fame was everything in Roman politics, and being able to throw huge games with tons of free food was a quick way to win it. I'll add, though, that much of this was done with the politicians' own funds. Holding the office simply provided the mechanism to do so. Both the aediles and the quaestors were elected by the tribal assembly, as was the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priesthood. Although the pontifex did not hold any major powers, it was a very symbolic position. The role was held for life once elected, and it meant one was the chief priest within Rome. The position of Pontifex Maximus could be held concurrently with other roles, so it was really like an added honorary title that marked out one of Rome's elite as being extra special. There were a few various religious duties assigned to the office, but on the whole, it didn't affect Rome's government as much as the other higher magistracies. The next office in the executive government was the praetor, and this was the first position held that was elected by Rome's Second Assembly. The evolution of this office came about as Rome expanded and needed more magistrates to help govern territory. The closest analogy that I think is appropriate would be to think of the praetors as governors. They were subordinate politicians that ruled over a smaller set of territory, but within that territory, they were the top person in charge. Now, much like a governor rules over a state or province, so too did the praetors rule over the territory they were placed in charge of. Given that, praetors held imperium, which was basically the power that sanctioned their ability to rule the civil government, as well as control the military within their region. The number of praetors shifted throughout Rome's history, as they gradually increased in number as Rome conquered more territory. The next highest position in Rome were the consuls. This was really the supreme office in Rome, and is similar to the modern concept of a president or prime minister. However, there were always 2 consuls that ruled together to balance out their power, and they both held imperium, granting them the ability to rule both the civil government and the military throughout all of Rome. I've already talked about the consuls previously, so I won't add too much more here. I'll simply state that although the consulship was the premier office, when it came to the civil government and handling legislation in Rome, the plebeian tribunes eventually grew to become the more powerful office, and this was much of the conflict that's coming for the late Republic. There was one more office above the consulship that was elected by the Second Assembly, and that is the office of censor. This position was almost more of a ceremonial, honorary position that was elected only once every 5 years, but it did come with some impressive powers. The 2 censors that were elected were in charge of holding, yes, you guessed it, a census. This was done every 5 years to ensure Rome had a proper accounting of who was eligible for service in the military. But because military service was tied up with social status and wealth, the censors were basically tasked with stratifying all of Roman society into the various classes. Given that, their main power derived from the ability for them to basically screw over their enemies by disenrolling them from one class or another. Now, this all came down to internal political squabbling, but it was a position that was both feared and revered by the Romans, even though the censors did not hold imperium. I'll mention one more special office within the Roman government, the position of Princeps Senatus, or, in English, First Senator. As a part of enrolling and disenrolling people into classes and wealth categories, the censors physically wrote these things down in a list. Whichever Roman senator the censors wrote down at the very top of this list, the first name that was placed over top of everyone else, would become known as the Princeps Senatus, and would remain so until the next census was conducted 5 years later. Now, this was really just an honorary position, but it offered prestige and bragging rights to whoever held it, and typically, the Princeps was allowed the ability to speak first during the assembly. Typically, it marked out the most famous politician for any given period, and important men like Scipio Africanus and Cicero held the title. To think of things loosely, the Princeps Senatus is somewhat similar to the modern position of the Speaker of the House or Speaker of Parliament. And that's all I really have planned to cover on Rome's Republican government. There is definitely tons and tons more information out there, and I've simply tried to synthesize all of this into something that's a bit more easy to digest. The early Republic still has a lot of question marks, and the only thing that is definitely sure is that there was a lot of turbulence in Rome's new Republic, and that the Roman people were still trying to figure things out. But as the dust settled on the struggle of the orders, the Republic nonetheless emerged, scarred from the conflict, but resilient. The early government was a complex tapestry of legislative assemblies and magistrates, and an amalgamation of different interests, ideas, and concerns. Consuls, praetors, censors, and tribunes all vied for power, their struggles and compromises shaping the course of Roman history. Yet, despite the turbulence, the Republic persevered for now, its institutions evolving to meet the challenges of a rapidly expanding state. The seeds sown in this tumultuous period would eventually bloom into a system of government that would inspire democracies for centuries to come, from Magna Carta to the early modern parliaments, all the way to the American Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Though the Republic's future was far from certain, the foundations laid in the early Republic would prove remarkably durable, a testament to the ingenuity and determination of the Roman people. But as the Republic stood poised on the threshold of this new era, the rumblings of war were becoming unmistakable. The looming conflict would soon shake the foundations of the state, testing the mettle of these institutions and the resolve of the Roman people. The Punic Wars, with their epic struggles and heroic figures, would push the Republic to its limits, forcing it to confront the ultimate question. Could its fragile system of government withstand the stresses of war and the temptations of empire? Thank you for listening. Feel free to check out our website at romeretold.com, where you can find out more about the podcast and find links to other platforms for listening. You can even support us through Patreon, where you can help support the time, money, and research that goes into providing this podcast. You can also find the link to our Discord server, where you can join our community, ask any questions, or offer suggestions for future podcast topics. Or you can just join in on any of our discussions about ancient Rome. Thank you, and we'll see you on the next one.